I recently picked up the older Thousand Suns Combat Patrol, and using some of the new Vallejo true metallic metals as well as some oil washes, we're going to be painting some Terminators. Now I'm really keen to give the new Vallejo line a run for its money, and to do that we'll be using the Sapphire Blue paint set. The Sapphire set is one of many in Vallejo's new line and makes use of their BSL method, or base, shade, light. In each set you've got a base paint that comes in both a brush and a pre-thinned airbrush happy time mix, a shade, and then a light. Now I didn't buy the shade, but have the others in the Sapphire set. That's because rather than using the shade in the set, I've opted to use oil washes. I'll explain a little bit later in the video why I chose a wash and the process I follow for mixing, applying, and then removing the wash. Now before jumping in and priming the models though, we just need to take care of the bases. To do that, I added a bunch of little rocks before then making use of Vallejo's brown earth. I like to use this paste on most of my minis as I find it makes for a great all-round material. In this case, we'll be using it as sand. Now for priming, I'm using Vallejo Grey through an airbrush. I'm generally a really big fan of using an airbrush to apply primer, just because I feel it allows me to have a much more consistent coat of primer applied to the whole model, as opposed to a rattle can. Now I don't feel necessarily obliged to have to use an airbrush or even using a grey, because the coverage of that initial sapphire blue that we'll be using as a base means that the underlying colour doesn't really matter a whole lot. Now after the primer's been applied and it's all nice and dry, it's now time to apply that initial base coat. Now I'll be using the pre-thinned sapphire blue through the airbrush, but if you don't want to use an airbrush, feel free to just use sapphire blue with a brush. Now I know there's a whole lot of discussion around whether it's better to apply the gold or the blue first, and I've only ever applied the blue as a base and then painted the gold trim with a brush. Now you might have a different approach if you do intend to do gold first. It is worth noting that there is actually a gold set that was released through Vallejo's True Metallic range, so if you would rather do the gold first, and that's definitely something worth taking a look at. Now after having applied and letting that base dry, we'll then go back in and apply a Sapphire Blue Zenithal to the model. We do this through the use of the light paint within the set, but because it's not pre-thinned, to ensure that we can shoot it through the airbrush without it clogging up and then also working effectively, we have to thin it. So I do this through the use of a 3-to-1 mix of Vallejo's airbrush thinner and Vallejo's airbrush flow improver. So basically combine this, chuck it into an airbrush, or a couple drops into an airbrush before then putting the paint in, and then backflowing the air into the actual cup to ensure that the paint as well as the thinner is mixed together. When it is mixed together, then it will flow through the airbrush fine. And we're basically using this to ensure that the high points of the model that would naturally receive more light are a lighter tone than those that would be hidden by shadows. Now I've tried both using and not using this Zenithal approach on some rubrics previously, and although I think the difference is fairly minor, I think it does actually help to reduce the otherwise same tone created by using only the base color. Now, before jumping into the gold trim, we've got to tackle both the cloth and the sorcerer's cloak. For their loincloths and the magic man's tassels, I went in with a base of Vallejo Steel Grey and then progressively mixed in Vallejo's off-white until I was just using the off-white. I find white to be a fairly tricky colour to paint, but using a grey base and then slowly working in more and more off-white really helps to sell the effect. There's also the Sorcerer's Cloak, which I painted with Vallejo's Hull Red, before then going in with an airbrush and hitting it with some flat red for some highlights. I paint the Hull Red with a brush to avoid overspray, as it's a paint with a fairly good coverage, which can then be easily highlighted with the flat red through the airbrush. With the cloth all sorted, we can now move on to the gold trim. For the gold, I use Vallejo's Glorious Gold, and I try to be careful, but it's not the end of the world if there's a bit of spillage, as we'll be coming back in with Sapphire Blue to fix any mistakes later. And whilst the trim on these big dudes isn't too bad, I found a good approach to painting the trim on the rubrics was to break them down into sections. So I'd basically do 5 at a time, and then do the legs on 5, then the backpack on 5, then the arm and gun, or the arms and gun, and then the head. Breaking the model into smaller chunks made it a bit easier for me to visualize the progress and not getting lost in the otherwise endless sea of trim. The Terminators obviously don't have a backpack, and their wide power stance makes it easier to paint under their legs, but I still painted in sections, focusing on legs and back, then arms and gun, then chest and head. With the gold all done, it's time to move on to the metallics, and we do that using Vallejo's dark gunmetal. I apply this on any of the exposed metal bits like the piping, the gun, and the killy cut swords. We'll also be filling in the eyes with the dark gunmetal, but it's worth noting that this is only to act as a base for the oil wash that we'll be applying later on, after which we'll be making the eyes then white. Now for any of the purity seals, the gems, and any of the Eyes of Magnus on any of the pieces of armor, we'll be coating them in hull red, again similar to the metallics, in preparation for the oil wash. Don't worry about these looking fairly dark and not particularly red. We'll make them pop a little bit after the oil wash. Now with all the other bits done and dusted, it's now time to clean up any spillage with some sapphire blue as well as glorious gold. You'll notice in some instances I wasn't bold enough with some of the trim, so I've gone back in and hit that a little bit harder. And now when all the cleanup is done, I like to hit the models with a gloss varnish. For this I like to use Vallejo's premium color airbrush satin varnish, as it comes pre-thinned, which obviously means it's going to flow a little bit easier out of the airbrush. Now I like to apply a varnish before an oil for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, it helps to hide any lumps or bumps that exists in the paintwork, so the wash will naturally pool into the crevices. Additionally, I've had oil washes loosen glue bonds to the point that they break when I'm subsequently removing the oil wash with makeup applicators. I'm recording the voiceover before I apply the oil wash, so I'm really hoping the varnish protects them this time. Now, after applying the varnish and letting it set, we're now going to make them all yucky. For oil washes, I like to apply two. Firstly, one that is applied to just the white robes. This is mixed with just ABT's Ivory Black and AK Interactive's White Spirits. How much spirits you actually need comes down to personal preference, but I'll generally get it to a contrast paint-like consistency. Now when applying an oil wash, I only use old synthetic brushes, as the oils will tend to mess up the bristles of nice brushes. So please don't be using any Raphael Kalinsky brushes for applying oil washes. Now after the initial wash, I'll then mix in some of ABT's Burnt Umber in a 3-to-1 mix with the Ivory Black. This will turn into more of a brown wash and will tint the armor and the gold really nicely. Similar to the first wash, slop it on. In terms of why I actually prefer using oil washes to an acrylic shader wash, now with oils, which you'll see shortly, after applying, you'll leave them for a short period of time, and then you'll typically make use of makeup applicators and a liberal use of white spirits to remove any excess oil that exists on the model. This will expose any raised areas that you can actually hit with the makeup applicator and leave any of the nooks and crannies, i.e. the shadowed areas, hidden in the wash. Additionally, the oil wash will tint the underlying paints nicely, which helps to bring the whole model together. In this particular instance, we'll be leaving the models for 30 minutes before using makeup sponges and applicators to remove any of the excess oil wash. In cases like the white robes, we might like to use a touch of white spirits to remove even more of the wash to avoid it looking too dirty. Now after doing a couple passes on all the models, there you go. I'm really happy with how these have turned out. Oil washes are really incredible for pushing a paint job to the next level. And you can basically leave the model there, but I'll be adding a couple of extra details to make the model pop a little bit more. One of the major downsides to oil washes though is that unlike acrylics, they need to cure, and depending on the amount you've used, it can take up to days. For models like these, I like to work off around 24 hours to allow the oil to cure, but if you're uncertain, you can always lick the model and see if you can taste oil. Now having waited 24 hours, we'll now jump in and push the model to the next level. Firstly, we'll use Vallejo Gold to hit the exposed gold areas to draw attention to the chest and the head as focal points of the model. Additionally, we'll go in and tackle a couple of areas in preparation for jumping back on the airbrush. Firstly, we'll go in and paint Vallejo's flat red on any purity seals, gems, and expose Eyes of Magnus on the armor. We'll then go in and hit the eyes with some white ink, ideally leaving some of the darkened recesses around the eye sockets to provide some immediate contrast. Finally, we'll then hit the runes on the guns with white ink with some glazed medium. This will ensure that the paint will flow into the recesses of the runes and leave the other surfaces undisturbed. Now, building on the steps from before, we'll hit any of the red purity seals, gems, and exposed eyes with a blast of Vallejo's red ink through the airbrush. As this is already a really thin mix, I only had a couple drops of Vallejo's airbrush flow improver, as without it I find it dries in the gun, causing issues with spray control. Finally, we'll then hit the model's eyes and gun runes with a blast of Vallejo's fluorescent green, again making use of Vallejo's flow improver because the fluorescent green is a fairly thin mix to begin with. We'll also go in and paint flat red on the purity seals, gems, and any of the exposed eyes of Magnus around the armor to really make them pop. Now, last but not least, the base. For the base of the base, we'll apply a liberal amount of Vallejo's earth to the sand and Vallejo's stonewall grey to the rocks. After that has dried, hit the sand with a fair bit of Agrax Earthshade and the rocks with Nuln Oil. After the wash has dried, hit the sand with Vallejo's earth again, applying it in a haphazard way akin to applying it through a dry brush. Then applying Plague Brown in a similar fashion, hitting a smaller amount of the base. Now hit the rocks with a similar approach with Stonewall Grey, rim the bases with some of Vallejo's charcoal, and the second last thing to do is to chuck on some cute little desert plants. I like to use Gamer's Grass as it looks pretty realistic, especially when compared to Flock. Now with that done, blast the model with another coat of gloss varnish, and then finally the base with a coat of matte varnish. I do this because the gloss varnish has a slight sheen to it, something I don't really want on the base or the rim of the base. Now with that all said and done, that is the Scarab Occult Terminators complete, and I'm really happy with how they've turned out. I really hope you've enjoyed the video. Best of luck if you've been following along from home, and all is dust, my friends. All is dust.